on Global Player. And
Play LBC.
leading Britain's conversation. This is LBC.
From Global's newsroom at 8 o'clock. Another Labour Party candidate, the former MP Graham Jones, has reportedly been suspended for allegedly making comments about Israel. He's seeking re-election in the Hyndburn area in Lancashire. Audio appears to have captured him, suggesting British people volunteering to fight for Israel should be locked up. Talks aimed at finding a ceasefire in Gaza have ended with no agreement. Egypt's president says he's had discussions with the head of America's CIA, as well as Qatar's prime minister and officials from Israel. Last night, President Biden said too many innocent people had died in Gaza. Former US ambassador to NATO, Kurt Volker, has been talking to LBC.
He is taking a more public stance to push back on what he's calling excessive Israeli bombings, lack of concern for civilians, both for domestic political reasons. And I think it's also where his thinking has gone.
Around 2,000 jobs are thought to be in jeopardy after the Body Shop appointed administrators. It has more than 200 stores in the UK. And the Chancellor's being urged to tackle the ill health of British workers in next month's budget. Figures show the numbers who are off because of long-term sickness hit a record high of 2.8 million for the last 3 months of last year. In the city, the FTSE 100 has closed down 61 points at 75.12. The pound will buy $1.26 and €1.
Leading Britain's...
Good evening. It's Tuesday's Cross Question. With me on the panel, to my right, Isabel Hilton, journalist and broadcaster who specialises in Chinese affairs and who is the founder of the China Dialogue Trust and is a contributing editor to Prospect magazine. Professor Michael Clarke, to my immediate left, defence and foreign affairs analyst, former Director General of the Defence and Security think tank, the Royal United Services Institute. To his left, Alistair Burt, former Conservative Middle East Minister and North Africa Minister, who also served in the Department for International Development. And to my right, Lord Kim Darroch, former British National Security Advisor, Ambassador to the US and Permanent Representative to the EU, who's now a crossbench peer. Now, for the eagle-eyed among you, you'll have spotted a theme. They're all here to take your questions on defence, foreign policy, security, all those sort of subjects. So if you'd like to give us a call, 0345 6060 973. You can text 84850 or say, Alexa, send a comment to LBC. And do watch us on Global Player.
Call 0345 6060 973. Tweet at LBC. Text 84850. Cross Question with Iain Dale. This is LBC.
Well, welcome to you all. Let's go to our first call. It's from Scott in West Hampstead. Hi, Scott.
Hello, Ian. Good evening, panel. My question is this. Is there any sort of pressure that the international community can put on the Israeli government to stop there being thousands of casualties in Rafah? I mean casualties on all sides, including, of course, the hostages.
Alistair Burt, former Middle East Minister, you'll have seen David Cameron's comments, which I think go as far as any British minister has gone in relation to Israel over the last few years, in basically issuing quite a stark warning.
That's right. There's different sorts of pressure that can be applied. The United Kingdom has made it clear that it supports the State of Israel in seeking to end the terrorist threat from Hamas on its border, but has made it very clear that the way in which that effort is being deployed in Gaza with the a colossal number of civilian casualties has reached a point where I think British patience is incredibly stretched. I think it's the same with Joe Biden. I've never heard a British minister be quite so clear in the expression of concern. But the difficulty for the UK and the US is what consequences there of this concern. It's all very well to express concern, but there's got to be something at the end of it. Now, when President Obama many years ago abstained on a vote in the UN in relation to Israel, it was the first time that had happened. There was a huge fuss. But there are practical things that can be done to express more than just concern. And I think the United Kingdom is getting close to this. And I think the pressure that's being applied to Prime Minister Netanyahu in the conduct of the campaign, with the number of civilians' deaths, is reaching a point where I think it's very difficult for Israel to resist that. But there's got to be other answers. Hamas should give up the hostages, and any sort of ceasefire has got to be accompanied by the negotiation process that will bring an end to this endless conflict. This must not be seen as yet another round in an endless conflict. Unless there is a definitive end to this, then the tragedy will be compounded in the future.
But you said other things can be done apart from a bit of rhetoric. What are those things?
At worst, there is a possibility of a restriction on the sale of arms, which may come through a court case being led by groups where the courts would make a decision on it.
Which has just happened in the Netherlands.
Just happened in the Netherlands. That would have a profound impact. But I think if one of the closest allies of Israel says, you can't achieve your objectives, Hamas will not be defeated militarily completely, and the hostages will not be freed this way. The vast majority of hostages are freed through negotiations. And the pressure in Israel, which is far more important than anything from outside, hostage families and others realising that this is a cul-de-sac for Israel that's leading to disaster, will not end with the security that it is searching for. And there are better answers, but it does need some reciprocal response from Arab states and from Palestinian leadership in order to get a proper settlement to this.
Isabel, Hilton, Benjamin Netanyahu doesn't seem to me to be somebody who responds to any amount of international pressure. He will continue to do what he wants to do, surely.
Well, he will, and he is sacrificing the interests of Israel for his own interests, it seems to me, in what he's doing. But of course, if he's out of power, he will, be subject to the corruption legislation, the corruption charges that he was trying to avoid. So he has, personally, a lot to lose. I guess his calculation is, at what point does he see an opportunity for an exit? Because, he's not going to win militarily. He's not going to get the hostages back, and he's not going to eliminate Hamas. But something could be offered him, which offers him some kind of personal guarantee. But I think he has to be out of power. I don't think we're going to get a solution to this while Netanyahu is in power. And for him to leave power, he needs to have some guarantees. That may be a cost. That may be a price that we have to pay.
Kim Darroch, it seems to many people that the Americans hold a big key to this. Clearly, from some of the headlines in today's newspapers, President Biden is not a fan of the Israeli Prime Minister. But what pressure can America in particular put on to Israel?
It's very difficult, especially in election year, especially given the history of America's role as Israel's greatest international supporter, for Biden to do something really dramatic. But I just offer a few possibilities. One, I think there is going to be a UN resolution draft at some stage on Rafah, and America traditionally will take the Israeli side and will veto something that the Israelis don't like. And as Alistair just mentioned, he's absolutely right. Obama once abstained on that, which enabled the resolution to go through, caused a huge row with Israel. And it's it's a gesture, a diplomatic gesture, but a really big one, especially if we were, which we haven't done so far, to vote for an immediate ceasefire, which would be a shift in our position as well. The other thing that's out there is, and this is relevant to both the UK and to the US, we have both taken the first step on sanctions, which is sanctioning the financial and travel restrictions on 4 Israeli settlers who are extremists and who have been causing a huge amount of trouble in the occupied territories. Now, I'm not going to overstate the likelihood of us going further down that path, but once you've taken the first step on the sanctions route, it becomes a bit easier to go a bit further. And I would suspect we would move before the Americans would. And I think Alistair is absolutely right. We do £450 million worth of arms sales, components for arms, 15% of the F-35s that they use over the last 6 years. And you can see lots of pressure in Parliament already on this. You can see something happening on that in the future. If the Israelis continue with their plans to do something in Rafah without a proper which would take weeks and months, by the way, a proper evacuation of 1.5 million Palestinian refugees there.
Okay. Michael Clarke, there seems to be a degree of consensus here. Are you going to agree with your colleagues?
Yes, it is difficult to pressure Netanyahu because he's doubled down on everything. I mean, the 7th of October attacks collapsed his whole policy. The policy he's pursued for more or less the last 20-odd years. It's in shatters. It's shattered. It's in pieces. And he is facing being thrown out of power, being back in front of the court on corruption charges and whatever flows from that. And so he has doubled down at every stage. And he knows that he's trying to appease his ultra-right-wing members of the cabinet, particularly Ben-Gvir, the security minister, and Smotrich, the finance minister. These people would be outliers in most other political systems, but in Israel at the moment they're in the government. And his government can be brought down by those two gentlemen. And so part of it is appeasing them to hold his government in place. And secondly, he's got nowhere else to go. In terms of his approach to this crisis, he started with a military approach. They declared war immediately under Article 40 of the Israeli Constitution. So they went to war immediately. And that's sort of understandable. But he's got nowhere else to go. Now, like all very strong autocratic leaders, he can turn on a sixpence, but I don't think he will. Unless he sees that that's his only way of survival. And at the moment, it doesn't look as if it is. His only way of survival is to keep on somehow getting to the Philadelphia corridor, the line that separates Gaza from Egypt, and then reassessing where his policy is. But most of us think that by the time you get to the Philadelphia corridor, the world will decisively have turned against Israeli action, which in itself is legal. Israel is reacting in self-defense under Article 51 of the UN Charter. But the way in which it's doing it is actually raising lots of issues in terms of human rights, possible war, potential war crimes. I think the genocide issue is the threshold is far too high. I think the genocide issue is irrelevant, really. But the IDF are increasingly, putting themselves in very vulnerable positions on lesser charges, which are, will be hard for the Israelis to get out of in due course.
Why is it that the Egyptians aren't opening their border?
A couple of reasons. One is the official reason is that they fear another Nakba, another 1948, where Palestinians are moved out and they'll never move back, and it just becomes another Gaza in Sinai. But of course, their other reason is that they don't want that problem, and they are really frightened of importing all of the issues. I mean, what they've had since the Camp David Agreement of 1978, which you reminded me in the previous programme, I got it wrong, and you reminded me that I got the date wrong.
That's one of my proudest achievements, correcting Michael Clarke.
The Camp David was 1978 and the treaty in 1979.
I've forgotten about that, but obviously...
Yeah, exactly. but as a result of that, they then changed their relationship between Egypt and Israel, and they are reasonably comfortable with that. And Sisi, President of Egypt, is no friend of Hamas at all, or the Muslim Brotherhood, and so the present situation sort of suits them. And the one thing they don't want to do is import the whole problem into the Sinai.
But from a humanitarian point of view, you can understand why people think, well, that is a short-term solution. Alistair, Burt.
One of the terrible consequences of what's happened since October the 7th is that a situation in the Middle East which looked like it might be turning at last into a situation where economic prosperity and relationships between former enemies had come to an end. You remember the talks between Saudi Arabia and Iran, between the UAE and Iran, and of course Saudi Arabia and Israel. This has all been laid waste. And a further dangerous thing is the relationship that Egypt and Jordan built up with Israel over a lengthy period of time. That has also now been put at risk. And on those two states, on King Abdullah and the efforts made long ago by President Sadat, a peace with Israel was built and an opportunity was there in the Middle East. This has all been destroyed by the consequences both of the Hamas attack and the response to it. And it is such a tragedy for people in the region because having had so much conflict thrust upon them, to have had a chance of a different future, and it's been stolen from them yet again. But I think from the Arab states that I speak to, their determination is not to see this as just another incident in the long-running conflict. They're not going to rebuild Gaza in order to have it bombed again. They want to see a comprehensive resolution of this, which involves West Bank, East Jerusalem, and Gaza. And perhaps the only bright light is that determination, if satisfied and fulfilled, could be a pathway to a different Middle East that the people in the region so much deserve.
But it has to have the cooperation of the Israelis. That you can't impose a two-state solution or whatever kind of solution onto Israel, can you, Isabel?
No, you can't. But then we come back to the figure of Netanyahu, because he is the biggest obstacle. He's never wanted a settlement with Hamas. There have been opportunities in the past that he has destroyed. And the whole logic of his position has been confrontation at every point, because he felt that if Hamas was always defined as an extremist organisation, then he was had the moral high ground. That has gone. I don't think Israel's moral high ground is looking quite as good as it did. Yes, the right to go to war, but that's jus ad bello, if you like, in the laws of war. Jus in bellum, which is how you conduct the war, as we said, is different. And he's driven a coach and horses through that. So I think that Israel has lost the moral high ground. If we take Netanyahu out of the picture, then you could imagine a leadership that could see the solution, see this crisis, because it's such a profound crisis, as perhaps the one that creates an opportunity for a solution. But he won't agree to it.
Kim, are you more optimistic about Netanyahu?
No, I'm not more optimistic about Netanyahu. I'm optimistic in a way that his extraordinarily long political career as Prime Minister of Israel, 16 years, longest serving Prime Minister in the history of the State of Israel, will come to an end, because despite his leadership of this ground offensive, maybe in part with some Israelis because of it, his opinion poll ratings are still very, very low in Israel. And frankly, people will blame him. His policy towards the Palestinians has been one of containment, literally containment in the case of the Palestinians in Gaza, and it comprehensively failed on the 7th of October. And that's what people think about him. So I think his political days are numbered. I think a two-state solution is going to be extraordinarily difficult to deliver, but I have never heard an alternative from any Israeli politician, any Israeli leader, that makes any sense other than this. So, where do they go without it? They go back to containment. They go back to the risks that they ran and eventually were realised on the 7th of October.
Right, thank you all very much for that. We'll move on to a different subject in a moment. It's an international affairs special edition of Cross Question. The number to call 0345 6060 973. It's 17 minutes past 8.
This is LBC.
With us on this special international affairs edition of Cross Question, we have Lord Darroch, Alistair, Burt, Isabel, Hilton and Professor Michael Clarke. Next question comes from Hassan in Cambridge. He says on a text, should the UK increase its defence budget, considering we spend 30% more than France, our closest peer, and nearly 25% more than Germany, which has a much larger economy? Now, when it comes to spending based on percentage of GDP, in 2023 it was 2.07 for the UK, 1.9 for France and only 1.57 for Germany. The figure for the US was 3.49. In all, only 11 of the 30 NATO members achieved the target of 2% of GDP spending on defence. Now, of course, this has come into the news. We covered it on the programme last night. Donald Trump's rather astonishing speech in South Carolina at the weekend. Michael Clarke, let's start with you.
I don't go along with all of those figures.
Oh, do you not? Where did you get them from, Corey? That's what I want to know.
Not really. Britain spends more than 2.07. It's about 2.2, 2.3% now. France is at about 1.9. It's quite close. You're right in that 11 of the 31 members of NATO currently make the 2%, and it will soon be about 15 or 16, probably by the end of this year. So it's not quite as bad as some people say. However, the basic reality is that NATO committed itself to 2% GDP target in 2006. It reiterated that in 2014 very strongly with an implementation programme, and it's slipped away from quite a lot of it. So it needs to do more, and Britain does better than most. But remember that we changed the definitions, and Kim will know about this one, that we were on very tight definitions of what constituted defence expenditure. Then we loosened them, which you are allowed to do by NATO. And so we started to include things like widows' pensions and things like that in defence expenditure. So we upped if we hadn't done that, we'd have slipped below 2% in 2014. We stayed above it, and we are still within the NATO definition, but we're not nearly as full of integrity as we were in the way we present the figures.
Well, those figures I quoted apparently came from the data site Statista.
Well,
Kim?
I have a friend who is serving in NATO at the moment, the civilian side, but quite a senior position. I was talking to him last week. He thinks that by the end of this year, that close to 20 of NATO members will be at 2%. He agrees with what Michael has said, but he goes a bit further than that and thinks that they'll be up to, as I say, up to 20. And critically, the Germans will by then be comfortably the biggest spenders in NATO and will also be at 2%, he thinks, by the end of this year. So the figures are changing.
And is that a result of Donald Trump in 2017?
I think it's primarily a result of war in Europe and what is going on. But I think if I were advising the Prime Minister or advising the NATO Secretary General, I would say the first NATO summit, if Donald Trump pitches up as president, should be a celebration of Donald Trump's great achievement in personally delivering this. Because if we're going to keep the Americans in NATO,
can you imagine
we need to give Trump the credit for this. I don't think it is really down to Trump. I think it's down to the state of geopolitics. But I do think he had some impact just with the harshness of his rhetoric on this. And he may have accelerated a bit. But I think it was going to happen because things are so bad globally.
And the thing about NATO forces, Poland, Germany and Finland are the three big force providers in Europe. And that's a new reality in a way, or will be. Absolutely. And the rest of us have got different things we can do. But those are the three big ones: Germany, Poland, Finland.
By the way, Michael is absolutely right on them fiddling the figures. Sorry.
I mean, the figures are one thing. It's what you spend the money on is another. And Britain now can't fill a football stadium with the army. And is a big aircraft carrier really what you want when you can't get the planes on it? I'm not sure that the spending, and you wouldn't expect it to have adjusted to the new reality by now. But what is that new reality going to be? We can anticipate that we will have to continue to fight Russia in some theatre or other. But the war in Ukraine is a combination of First World War slog and advanced technology. And I'm not clear that the British Armed Forces are focusing on the right one, and that I think is an issue for spending. And the shape of Michael mentioned Finland. I mean, if you look at the shape of the Finnish armed forces. It runs right through society. It's not just about who's in the army. It's about civil defence. It's about an integrated kind of approach to defence, which we've lost. We just don't have that. We can't recruit in the army. We don't have a civil defence capability, and we need to build that back up. So yes, the sum is important, but actually the thinking is more important.
I was listening to the Finnish Prime Minister, the Finnish Foreign Minister this evening, and she was making the point that they just have long experience on of their eastern neighbour.
Yeah.
That is why the whole country is ready. And she said, in answer to a question, what do you think Putin would achieve by an attack on Finland to subjugate it? And she said he never would. There's no question that the Finnish people would accept Putin rule or Russian rule or anything like that. But they are prepared, and they're prepared right the way through society. The other issue on our spending, and I'd like to ask Michael this, was I reading at the weekend that we spend a significant amount on nuclear. On the nuclear deterrent, and that rather distorts the amount of money we've got for other things. Is that right?
It's big spending. We're into the big spending years now, and then it tails off. Okay. Overall, over the 40-year life of the project, it's about 5 to 6% of the defence budget. So it's affordable if you think it's important, and I have to say, I think it's more important now than it's seemed to have been in the last 20 or 30 years. So it's affordable, but the problem with the nuclear is you get these big spending periods, and we're into one now.
I thought it was just a bit alarmist at the weekend. If you read the report, you thought, we're spending all our money on nuclear, and that was another bit of false
It's not cheap.
Thanks.
But, we can afford it if we choose to. Yeah.
Let's just add a follow-up text question from David into the equation. Can Russia really win a war against Western Europe, even without a Trump-led USA being part of that conflict, when it's incapable of winning one against Ukraine? Isabel?
Well, it's a very open question, but I think Russia can do an awful lot of damage to Western Europe. There are new theatres opening up of war. The High North has always been a security. There's always been a security dimension there. But if you look at the threats in the High North now, they're very different. All our data cables, our energy supply, it runs along the seabed in the High North. Those things weren't built to be defended, and we had an example of a Chinese ship called the New Polar Bear dragging its anchor across the Baltic and severing three cables just for practice. Then, escorted by a Russian ship. There are ways of degrading capacity which are not all-out war, which, have expanded the range of things we need to worry about. So they're critical infrastructure of all kinds, and that includes these cables. We have no particular plan for that. So, we're going to have to think about what happens short of war, because, there is all-out war. But, if you look at the Chinese tactics, for example, they're very, very good at getting what they want without triggering that threshold, without triggering an armed response. And that is another set of thinking that I think we have yet to do.
Michael, are we at a point where as a country we need to rethink our entire defence policy? Not just in terms of spending, but, as Isabel says, it's what we should be concentrating on. Because if you have the head of the army making a speech effectively predicting a war against Russia and saying, well, we've got to think that we are the pre-war generation. Well, you think back to the early 1930s, and we need to learn a few lessons from that.
A few people have been saying that recently, because we've always defined ourselves as post-war, post-Cold War, post-9/11. It's always in the rear. And some people start to say, well, supposing we thought of ourselves as pre-war, would things start to look different? And the answer is yes, of course they would. And the period we've had since 1945 of the peace and prosperity has got us into this mentality that somehow we are entitled to it. And of course we're not, because historically, over the last 1,000 years, that it's very much the exception. And so it's coming to an end. And our peace dividend, we spent it, fair enough. And we've now got to start to rethink, as you say, not just the expenditure, but our priorities and what we do. If you think about it, in 1990, we were spending about the same on defence as the health service, roughly. By the year 2000, we were spending half as much on defence as the health service. By 2020, we're spending a quarter on defence as the health service, and now less than that. Now, I'm not saying we should decrease health spending, but we've got to reprioritise somehow to put more into defence, not just the ships, tanks and planes, but all the backup that is required in defence industrial structures and so on to keep the thing going. We've got to get back to the historical norm where we may have to be prepared to deter the war we don't want to fight, but you can only do that by looking as if you can fight it, and to actually sacrifice something for our future generations' prosperity.
Alistair, I see no appetite among any political party to have this debate.
No, Michael's right. The recalculation required to move from a post-war society to something approaching pre-war is such a horrific shift of thinking. Partly also because you can't back it up. It's supposition and surmise, bearing in mind what's going on, that it's difficult for any political party to encapsulate it. Certainly, being prepared to talk about how you make sure your society is resilient, whether it's in relation to cyber attacks and the like. Tom Tugendhat is an excellent security minister. He talks a lot about the precautions that we're taking at the moment and the threats that are coming from various places. The cyber attacks, the threats coming from China, from Russia. I think there is a limit to how much you can scare the public, because you want them to understand that these threats are serious, so you want to make them understandable rather than catastrophic. I think all of us, however, we've all visited societies that have turned from something stable into something fragile very quickly. All of us have had experience of visiting places that have been the subject of conflict, and Isabel is right. Nobody is going to win an all-out war, but if you think of the degree of misery that people under fire are experiencing in Syria, in Sudan, in Yemen, in Gaza, in the Ukraine, nobody wants to live like that. And so an awful lot of damage can be done unless the efforts made to resist such a turn to conflict really gain momentum and people realise how fragile things are at the moment.
Well, in the last few minutes, President Biden has branded Donald Trump's comments about NATO dumb, shameful, dangerous and un-American. Well, that just about covers it, doesn't it? 8:32 on LBC News Headlines with Tim Daly.
Talks involving the US, Egypt, Israel and Qatar on the ceasefire in Gaza have ended without a breakthrough. Calls are growing for Israel to hold back on a planned assault in Rafah in the south of the territory. Another Labour Party candidate, the former MP Graeme Jones, has reportedly been suspended for allegedly making comments about Israel. Audio appears to have captured him suggesting British people volunteering to fight for Israel should be locked up. And LBC has learned the business secretary Kemi Badenoch is attempting to secure trade deals with 3 more US states. Ministers are due to have discussions with New York, Colorado and Oregon in the coming weeks. LBC weather, dry and clear tonight for northern Scotland. Elsewhere, cloudy with longer spells of rain and a low of -5 degrees.
This is LBC.
Here in
36 on LBC. This is an International Affairs special edition of Cross Question. We have with us Lord Darroch, Kim Darroch, former British National Security Advisor, and many other things. Alistair Burt, former Conservative Foreign Office Minister. Isabel Hilton, the contributing editor to Prospect and the founder of the China Dialogue Trust. And Professor Michael Clarke, Defence and Foreign Affairs Analyst, former Director General of RUSI. Right, let's go to Ulf in Hamburg. Ulf, what would you like to ask?
Good evening, panel. Guten Abend, Ian. Should the UK support Europe, some sort of European Defence Union, the EU, whatever, in an endeavour to obtain nuclear weapons?
Well, I'm sure you're all gagging to answer this one, Kim.
Thank you very much. Look, it's difficult for a country which has nuclear weapons to say to its allies, no, you shouldn't have them. I mean, what right have we to say that? But I think the priority in terms of what Europe should be doing on defence is more conventional weapons, more high technology, better defences against things like cyber, and particularly because our capacity is so low now, a greater capacity to produce the kind of stuff that Ukraine is currently running short of, which is everything from basics to rockets and missiles and so on. So that would be where I would like Europe to put its energy and its money if there is a lot more available in the future, which I hope there will be.
Is it now inevitable? Let's take Brexit out of the equation here. Is it, if you can, is it inevitable that Britain and Europe will come together and cooperate more on defence? I mean, I think you know more about this than I do, particularly you, Michael, I guess, about the cooperation that already exists between Britain and France, for example. But do you foresee sort of a growing defensive relationship?
Yes. I mean, it's growing closer anyway because of sheer necessity. And the fact is, Britain and France are the two most capable powers, or have been traditionally, and Germany will become much more capable again, thank goodness. But that British-French relationship has always, it's kind of gone apart and come together and so on. It's always a bit volatile. But ultimately, we need each other. And Paris and London both know that. And Paris, London and Berlin know that we will need each other. Where that leaves Rome, I'm not certain, because we used to think they were the big four. But the big three will remain the big three in defence terms, not in other respects, because they have to, because they just have common interests across Europe. And those interests are becoming ever more common as we go into the 2020s. This is going to be a really tough decade. I've been writing about this for some years now. The 2020s will be a really tough decade for Europe, just in the nature of things. And as it happens, because of the Ukraine war and because of Gaza, it's even tougher than I thought it was going to be.
Alistair?
I think, like Michael, there's no doubt that what has happened in Ukraine and the threats that Putin has made towards other states, including the Baltics, has shocked Europe. We've spoken about ourselves thinking about being in a post-war age. Imagine what it must be like on continental Europe. I mean, we didn't suffer occupation, they all did. The idea of this coming back to them must be horrific. So I think there will be a lot of concentration on defence. If the Americans decide to do anything serious in relation to NATO and leave, NATO would still have a nuclear deterrent in the United Kingdom. So it would still be there.
And France.
And France, of course. I don't think we would be encouraging anybody down the road of nuclear weapon development. I think proliferation of nuclear weapons is one thing that the world has stood out against, and it's by and large held, even in very difficult circumstances. The Middle East is waiting for an opportunity to go down that road, should it be opened. And I think we've all worked very hard to try and prevent it. I would be disturbed. And what would be the point of individual European nations doing this? It would make the United Kingdom would make it clear that European defence was similar to NATO defence, and that we would protect each other. And if that message is clear, that deters the aggressor.
Isabel?
I completely agree. I mean, the point of having nuclear weapons is mutually assured destruction. It's the deterrence effect. We have that. There's nothing to be gained by other European countries spending a lot of money and, a lot of technical effort to produce something nuclear when actually, as we've been discussing, the need is for capacity to produce regular munitions, which we don't have. Ukraine's running out of bullets because we can't make them fast enough. And we don't have that industrial capacity anymore. And if you look at any scenario that we're likely to face, that's going to be a necessity. And there is, we cooperate with different configurations of outside NATO. For example, we have a cooperation with the Balts, where there are kind of overlapping interests, and clearly we have a big interest in the security of the North because of of our dependencies for energy and data, and Britain still plays a very active role, but configuring that effort, I think it wouldn't be helped by assistance of more nuclear states.
Ulf, let me come back to you. What prompted you to ask the question?
Yesterday, Katharina, I forgot her name, the Social Democratic Spitzenkandidat for the European Parliament, mentioned that it might be necessary to think about a European nuclear deterrent. And I agree. I have one question as regards the British nuclear force. Are you willing to jeopardize Birmingham and London for the sake of Riga and Warsaw and Berlin?
I think that's an impossible question to answer, isn't it? Does anyone wish to have a go at that?
Well, it's the same as saying, can we believe in the American deterrent?
Yeah.
Would the Americans risk, Washington or Chicago for the sake of a European city? They're saying, would Britain risk one of its cities for the sake of a continental city? I think the answer is yes, because we are in a fairly small neighbourhood. It's not quite the same as the North America question, because we're in a pretty small neighbourhood in Europe, in geographical terms. And I don't think Britain has ever seen a meaningful difference between defending ourselves on the inner German border and now defending ourselves on NATO's boundaries, even though they're 1,000 miles nearer to Moscow than they were, as opposed to defending ourselves, on the shores of Hastings.
And staying clear of nuclear blackmail means talking convincingly about doing exactly that.
Yeah.
We're all at risk.
We're all at risk. Yeah. And if you fail to respond to an attack on Riga,
But that's an
Birmingham's
interesting
next.
point, because then you get the divide between the political military classes and the people. We did a phone in a couple of weeks ago after that speech by Sir Patrick Sanders.
Sanders, yeah.
And I asked, would you be prepared to fight for your country? And the audience was completely split. Half of them said, well, of course, if we were invaded or if we were about to be invaded, of course I would. But the rest said, I'm not fighting for Estonia.
I think the word Poland could be deployed here.
Well, indeed. Absolutely. But, I found it actually quite a worrying conversation in some
But
ways.
it's very context-specific, though, Ian. That's the point. I mean, people are still in this context, and we're still living in the post-Cold War world where prosperity and peace are natural conditions. Well, they're not. And as crises arise, I think people's sense of context changes. I mean, in the 1930s, look at all the appeasement and pacifism there was in the 1930s. When the war started, there were only 60,000 conscientious objectors out of a country of 45 million people. Context changed very quickly.
Well, context changed a little bit today, didn't it, when Putin put the Estonian Prime Minister on his most wanted list. I don't know whether we will look back in 5 years' time and think that was of any significance.
Just 2 quick points. It's the absolute core of NATO, the Article 5 commitment to collective defence. An attack on one is attack on all. And if we start saying, that's why it's so shameful that Trump is questioning it, we start saying, well, not sure if we would go and defend Vilnius, then NATO becomes not a military alliance, but an exercise in bluster. So it's absolutely critical we believe that. And I mean, if you look at British history, we spent most of the last few centuries fighting on European soil about one issue or another. So it's not as if it's only ever defending the homeland for us. It's absolutely critical, this, and we have to.
It's always known in historical circles, the continental commitment, and it sort of rises and falls in British history, but it's always there. The continental Belgium.
Yeah. Well, Ulf, you provoked a very interesting discussion. Thank you for your question. We're going to come on to a very different subject in a minute. Isabel will like it. It's 8:45.
This is LBC.
8, we have Lord Darroch, Alistair, Burt, Isabel, Hilton and Professor Michael Clarke with us answering your questions. Now, we've got a couple here related to China, which they're very different, but I'm going to ask them both at the same time, just for time's sake. David in Tufnell Park says, how can the UK and the West reconcile economic dependency on China as their factory with their growing military threats in the region, especially Taiwan? I'm not quite sure that makes total sense. And Sandy says, can we ever tackle climate change without countries like China pulling their weight? And will they ever have the incentive to do so? Isabel, Hilton, the floor is yours.
Well, let me start with the second one and look at the question of whether China's pulling its weight. China is the world's biggest emitter, and no, we can't resolve climate change without China. But China, is a massive contradiction. So it is the biggest emitter of greenhouse gases. It also has by far the world's largest installed capacity in renewables. And its per capita carbon emissions are half those of the United States. So if we're looking at weight pulling, there are plenty of people to blame. China, there are complications with China's climate position. China made an industrial bet on low-carbon technologies around 2009, 2010, because it was looking for the technologies of the future, and it invested massively in everything to do with renewable technologies and the supply chain. So it now dominates all of those. So if we are to make a carbon transition, a climate transition, which we need to do, then at the moment there is no alternative but Chinese technologies. That's a big trade problem because China does subsidize its sector and it has overcapacity, so there is dumping. So there is a constant threat in the industrial economies of Europe, for example. There's a big one coming up with electric vehicles. Germany is massively dependent on its own automotive sector, and it is going to be undercut by 10,000 euros a vehicle by the Chinese. So, it's a big set of dilemmas to wrestle with. And I guess you have to say, what's the biggest threat? Well, the biggest threat is clearly climate change. The rest of it is about policy, and that kind of policy question, which I think Europe and the United States have been slow on, needs to be addressed fairly robustly, or we are going to get just conflict all the time. And that's difficult. China has committed to tripling its renewables by 2030. It's going to peak its emissions probably this year. It's committed to net zero by 2060. So it's not that far off, the kind of global commitment. Whether any of us are doing enough to keep global average temperature rises below 1.5, no, not really. We're not going enough. We've been backsliding. So, there's, as I say, there's plenty of blame to go around in climate. But if you're going to look at China, you have to look at both sides of it. Its mitigation hasn't moved as fast as its commitment to renewables. And, that it was 80% coal when I founded China Dialogue in 2006. It's now, in terms of installed capacity, at 50%, but in terms of actual use, they're still using 60%, 70% fossil fuels. So, there are contradictions here, but then there's work still to do. But China could be a huge asset in the climate fight if we can sort out the conflicts of interests of industrial policy.
Kim.
Just on the climate point, the other thing, and I agree with everything that you said, the other thing about China is it's as vulnerable as anyone, and more vulnerable than some,
absolutely,
to the impact of climate change. And much of Chinese industry is on their eastern seaboard and not many feet above sea level. So actually China, in its own interest, needs to act on climate change. And they're smart enough to realise that, although they may not be doing enough. Second point, quickly. Isabel is absolutely right. To reach net zero by 2050, we need to be 43% down, I think, on emissions by 2030. At the moment, we're 9% up. So we are way, way off where we need to be, despite the perfectly creditable and legitimate efforts of successive COP conferences. So not just China, but the whole international community needs to do much more on this. Just on the first question, which is an interesting one, look, the West really has to has to be capable of looking after itself and running its economy without complete dependency on China. And that's not an easy thing to do, given how much we get from China at the moment, but supply lines are shortening somewhat, and I think in some areas, particularly high technology, we're trying to get off the sort of China drug. But there is, I think, a real risk moment coming up towards the end of this decade, because Xi has said that the integration of Taiwan with China, the incorporation of Taiwan with China, is inevitable during his time as leader. And the Taiwanese have just elected the most independent-minded leadership they could have done. So it's not going in the right direction from the Chinese point of view. I don't think they're going to invade or anything, but there are things they can do that would be highly disruptive, like blockades and incursions, other forms of pressure on Taiwan that might just start to build up over the next 3 or 4 years. We need to watch out for that and be prepared for it.
I keep wanting to go on holiday to Taiwan, but I know the week I go, China will invade. So
no, you'll be fine. Go quickly.
You're okay? Yeah, I'll be okay, will I? Alistair?
I think both Kim and Isabel have spoken a great deal of sense. It's very tempting to retreat into a situation in which we're always going to be looking at risk from China without always appreciating how vulnerable China is itself. And I think we need to be more conscious of that. We need to recognise that technology changes at a bewildering pace, and what we see as the situation now, vulnerability, may be completely different in 10 years' time. We need to keep doors open. Universities need to be in contact with those in China. We should be resisting closing all the doors, conscious of where the political pressures are. But the moment you start closing doors on people, your then difficult problem is when you start reopening them again, and it's rather better to keep things where we are, but be very wary. China's foreign policy is number 1 China, number 2 China, number 3 China. I think that's about the only thing I believe Donald Trump got absolutely right.
So if I was being facetious, I could say that should be British foreign policy too.
Well,
Kim might jump down my throat on that one.
It always is, but it's less. It's more understated.
Okay, very British. Michael?
Just one big sort of big hand issue, but small addendum to what Isabel was saying. Just on climate change, don't forget when we're talking about who's most responsible and what we've got to do. We in Europe or Western world, we outsourced a lot of our pollution to China by allowing so much manufacturing to go to China. So they're actually, by doing all this manufacturing, they are actually producing the CO2 and the gas, all the gases that we would otherwise be producing if we were manufacturing more for ourselves. And we've now got the opportunity to onshore more of our manufacturing, but with new technologies. And we've given China the problem by, as it were, according to China, this leading role in all of our manufacturing.
And the point is that dependency was created over a period of globalization and China, joining the world. Yeah. When Western companies found it highly advantageous to manufacture in China. The labour was cheap, the door was open, and there was the possibility of a domestic market which is bigger than anybody's. All of that has changed.
And it was never a policy, it just happened. It was a phenomenon.
It just happened, exactly.
It just happened,
So people 15 years ago would talk about the China price, how cheaply you could produce goods. Now the talk is friendshoring, reshoring, China +1, because, again, the shock of Russia's invasion of Ukraine and looking at the dependencies that Europe had on Russian energy has made a lot of big companies rethink, and so you get China +1. So you're not actually moving out of China. Nobody's putting new money into China, and China's worried about that. But if you have new investment, then if you're Apple, you open up a facility in India. It's not that it's going to replace what happens in China, because that's very big, but it's a hedge, and we see a lot of that right now. So those dependencies will become, slightly less acute.
A texter says here, what a grown-up and thoughtful debate tonight. What do you mean tonight? we have that every night.
What do you do on another night?
Well, exactly. I'm beginning to wonder. Right, our final question comes from Susie in Leeds. You all have great knowledge of many parts of the world and have plenty of experience of travelling around it. So what is your dream money, no object, travel destination. And on that note, Stephen Colchester texts, Taiwan is a beautiful country with fantastic temples and museums. Definitely go, Ian. I really want to. I've actually got a friend who lives there and doesn't seem at all worried about Chinese invasion.
It's the best bit of the
Isabel,
Chinese
your
culture.
dream destination.
Well, I've been to Taiwan, so otherwise that would be high on my list. Actually, I'd love to go to the Antarctic while it lasts. I've been to the Arctic, I've been to Greenland, and I have a fascination with the extremes, so that would be mine.
Kim?
This sounds prosaic, but I have been lots of places around the world, and where I would come back to would be the Greek islands, but on a sailing yacht, at least 100 foot. The professional do the tricky things like docking in very small Greek harbours, and when the wind is blowing, I'm steering it.
You do need to be a billionaire to do that sort of thing.
Well, it's money no object.
That is true. That is true. Michael?
Yeah, I mean, sailing around the world. I mean, not going to any one place, but if I could get a decent-sized yacht that I can handle properly, then sail around the world. And I admire so much people who do that, take whole families around the world for 3 years. I'd love to do that.
Alistair?
Well, apart from going into space as a tourist and going round, which would be spectacular, my low-key sustainable journey would be deluxe rail, London to Paris to Berlin and down to Lake Como, and a month on the shore of Lake Como. I don't think you can beat it.
Oh, God, I was there for a week once and it bored the living daylights out of me.
You weren't staying with George, though, were you?
George who?
Clooney.
Oh, no, I certainly wasn't.
That makes a bit of a difference.
I certainly wasn't, no. I was giving a speech and I thought I'd stay around.
Como's beautiful.
Thank you so much. Really, really interesting hour to Kim Darroch, Alistair Burt, Isabel Hilton and Michael Clarke. We'll have you back again very soon, I hope. Now, the next hour, a poll of students aged 16 to 18 has found that more than 4 in 10 are concerned about having children in the future. Some of the reasons they gave were fears about pregnancy and childbirth, self-doubt, financial burdens, health and well-being, hindrance to personal aspirations, and non-inclusive LGBTQ+ education. Many of those questioned also did not think they were being taught enough about reproductive health. Well, if that doesn't get your juices flowing, I don't know what will. I'd love to hear your calls on that, because if 4 in 10 youngsters aren't going to have children, who's going to pay for my pension? 0345 6060 973 is the number to call.
On your radio, on Global Player, and
Play LBC.
leading Britain's conversation. This is LBC.